At 10 o'clock on a June morning in 1942, in an office in Prague, a man in a grey uniform approved a set of orders that would erase a Czech village from the map. History books tell you that villages die because of battles, artillery barrages, tank assaults, front lines passing over them like a storm. Lidice did not die in a battle. Lidice died because Karl Hermann Frank read a report, picked up a pen, and decided that an entire community would pay for a crime it did not commit. This is not legend or rumor. It is a documented episode of the Nazi occupation of Bohemia and Moravia, reconstructed from orders, testimonies, and the records of a post-war trial where those pieces of paper were read aloud as evidence. On one side of that paper is the signature of a man who never stepped into Lidice before he ordered it destroyed. On the other side are the lives of 340 human beings who woke up on the night of 9 and 10 June 1942 thinking they still lived in a place called home. The rule you are taught is simple. Wars are decided in battles by generals and soldiers, by tanks and planes. But there is another rule, quieter and more insidious. Entire communities can be condemned in offices, with ink and seals, by officials who never smell the smoke. Karl Hermann Frank was not the only architect of terror in occupied Czechoslovakia. He answered to Berlin, to Himmler and Hitler, to Reich protectors whose names stand in the same dark ledger. But in the months after Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated in Prague, it was Frank who sat at the desk where orders for reprisals were drafted and approved. It was Frank who helped choose which villages would be made examples. It was Frank whose name would be forever linked to Lidice. By the end of this story, you will have to decide what Karl Hermann Frank really was. A loyal bureaucrat obeying a genocidal system, a calculating mastermind of terror, or the quiet face of evil itself. To understand how a village could be killed on paper, you have to understand the man holding the pen and the world he helped build. Karl Hermann Frank was born in 1898 in Karlsbad in the Sudetenland, a region of Bohemia with a large ethnic German population inside what became Czechoslovakia after World War I. He grew up resentful of the new state that in his eyes favored Czechs over Germans. That resentment became ideology. In the 1920s and 30s, he joined Sudeten German nationalist movements and then the Nazi Party, rising as a committed agitator against the Czech government. When Hitler turned his gaze toward Czechoslovakia, men like Frank were his natural allies. After the Munich Agreement and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia in 1938-39, German troops marched into the Czech lands of Bohemia and Moravia. On paper, Berlin created a protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. In reality, it was occupation, a critical industrial region folded into the Nazi war machine, its politics crushed, its people subjected to German rule. From 1939 onward, Karl Hermann Frank moved quickly through the new power structure. He became state secretary in the office of the Reich Protector, a kind of colonial governor appointed by Hitler. Later, he would be titled Minister of State for Bohemia and Moravia. Titles aside, his position gave him sweeping authority over police, SS, and Gestapo operations on Czech soil. If you were a Czech teacher, worker, priest, journalist, or factory owner in those years, your fate could be decided in offices Frank controlled. The protectorate under Nazi rule was a laboratory of controlled terror. On the surface, some semblance of normal life continued. Czech factories turned out weapons and equipment for the Wehrmacht. Shops opened. People went to work. But under that thin skin, there was constant fear of denunciation, of a knock on the door at night, of being summoned to a Gestapo office and never returning. Special courts sentenced people to death for political offenses with numbing regularity. Executions were announced in newspapers as warnings. In September 1941, after earlier policies were judged too lenient, Hitler sent one of his most ruthless lieutenants to tighten the grip, Reinhard Heydrich. As acting Reich protector, Heydrich combined calculated concessions, higher rations for workers, promises of stability, with violent repression. Under his watch, resistance networks were hunted, Czech elites arrested or executed, and deportations of Jews from the protectorate accelerated. The message was clear. Obedience might bring a tolerable life. Disobedience would bring death. Karl Hermann Frank was Heydrich's right hand in this. He was the state secretary, the man who knew the local terrain, the administrators, the police chiefs. He helped translate Berlin's ideology into specific measures, which newspapers to shut down, which groups to ban, which protests to break, which people to arrest and hang. He was not a random cog accidentally dropped into the system. He had helped build it and believed in its goals. But even within that brutal order, there were calculations. Frank was ambitious. He understood that in the Nazi hierarchy, ruthlessness could be a path to promotion. He also understood that even men like Heydrich had to answer for failures. If unrest boiled over, if resistance grew too bold, Berlin would look for someone to blame. On 27 May 1942, the bomb that would test all of these calculations exploded on a Prague street. Operation Anthropoid had been planned in London by the Czechoslovak government in exile and executed by parachutists trained by the British. As Heydrich's car slowed on a curve, the assassins attacked. Heydrich was wounded and died of his injuries on the 4th of June 1942. It was one of the most daring acts of resistance in occupied Europe. For the Nazis, it was also a humiliation. A Reich protector, Himmler's protege, killed in broad daylight in a city that was supposed to be under total control. For Hitler, it was a direct challenge. His response was fury and a demand, vengeance so terrible that no one in the protectorate would ever dare such a thing again. Karl Hermann Frank heard that demand as both an order and an opportunity. If reprisals were too mild, he could be accused of weakness, of failing to keep order in his domain. If they were harsh, if they showed imagination and cruelty, he could present himself as the man who had reasserted German power in Bohemia and Moravia. When Reinhard Heydrich died on the 4th of June, Berlin wanted blood. Karl Hermann Frank understood that how he answered that demand would define his standing in the Nazi state and seal the fate of thousands of Czechs who had never touched a weapon. For days after the attack, Prague became a city under siege. SS and Gestapo units flooded the streets. Raids swept through working-class neighborhoods and quiet suburbs alike. Houses were searched, basements and attics probed, papers examined. Hundreds, then thousands were arrested and taken to interrogation centers. There, torture was not an aberration but a method. Beatings, sleep deprivation, threats against family members. Notices went up warning that anyone who aided the assassins would be executed with their entire family. Karl Hermann Frank sat at the hub of this tightening web. He chaired emergency meetings, coordinated with Gestapo chiefs and SS commanders, passed on Hitler's orders for draconian measures. Reports crossed his desk listing numbers. So many arrested, so many executed. Rewards were authorized for information leading to the attackers. Deadlines came from Berlin: find the perpetrators or pay the price. For all the terror, the assassins remained at large. They were hidden by a chain of resistance members, moving between safe houses, finally taking refuge in a Prague church crypt. The longer they eluded capture, the more the regime's fury curdled into a desire to make an example beyond the individuals responsible. If they could not yet catch the men who threw the bomb and fired the Sten gun, they would punish the soil that had sheltered them. Somewhere in that blur of reports, a name appeared: Lidice. Lidice was a small village northwest of Prague, a farming and mining community with a few hundred inhabitants. German intelligence had intercepted a letter suggesting that a local family had a son serving with Czech forces abroad. Other fragments, real or imagined, were woven into a narrative that linked Lidice to the resistance. In the fevered logic of Nazi reprisals, sympathy could become complicity in a few strokes of a pen. Karl Hermann Frank received the reports. On his desk, Lidice was not a cluster of houses and lives, it was a file. Population figures, alleged connections, location on a map, conveniently close to Prague, but not so large as to cause logistical complications. In the calculus of terror, it was almost ideal, big enough that its destruction would be noticed, small enough to be manageable. We cannot know every thought that went through Frank's mind as he read that file. We do know the outcome. Orders were drafted for a reprisal that went beyond arresting suspects or shooting hostages. The plan called for the male population of Lidice, aged roughly 15 and above, to be executed. The women were to be deported to concentration camps. The children were to be separated, a small number selected for Germanization, to be sent to be raised as Germans, the rest removed and killed. The village itself was to be destroyed, houses burned, then demolished, the church and cemetery razed. The very name Lidice was to be wiped from signs and maps. In that moment, Lidice stopped being a place on a map and became a message. Karl Hermann Frank was not thinking about the faces of the people there when they went to bed that night. He was thinking about what their erasure would say to the rest of the country and to Berlin. The night of 9 and 10 June 1942, trucks rolled toward Lidice. Imagine you are a 12-year-old boy there. You live in a modest house on a street you can walk end to end in 5 minutes. You know the smell of your father's coat when he comes in from the fields, the feel of your mother's hands on your shoulders as she brushes dust from your hair. You have heard grown-ups mutter about Germans and war, but the front feels far away. The nights are usually quiet. This night is not. You wake to engines and shouting, headlights slice across walls, boots hammer on the road. Someone yells your father's name. Your parents are already up. Their silhouettes move in the doorway. A German voice barks orders you don't understand. Then your father's voice, rough and strained, telling you to get dressed quickly. Outside, the village is lit by truck lamps and searchlights. SS men and police fan out, rifles slung, pistols at their belts. They go door to door, dragging people from their homes. You see neighbors you've known all your life standing in the road, in night clothes, coats thrown over pajamas, faces pale. The men are separated from the women and children. Your father's hand grips your shoulder for a second, then you're pulled away. Your mother calls your name, her voice cutting through the chaos, but a soldier shoves her into a different line. You are pushed toward a group of children. The older boys look like they want to be men and are terrified that they already are. Some toddlers cry. A German officer walks along the line, looking at faces as if they were livestock. You do not yet know that for the Nazi state, that is exactly what you are. Entries in a racial ledger to be sorted, valuable or disposable. The men are marched to a farm outbuilding on the edge of the village. At dawn, they are taken in groups of 10 to a yard, a wall, a firing squad. Shots echo, then again, then again. Around 170 men and boys are killed in this way over the course of the day. You stand in another building with other children listening. You count the volleys without meaning to, 10 at a time. You think, if they stop now, maybe someone lives. They do not stop. The women, over 180 of them, are loaded onto trucks and taken away. Some have babies in their arms, others hold the hands of older children until soldiers pry them apart. They are sent to Ravensbrück and other concentration camps. Many will not return. Later, you and the other children are transported as well. A few with hair and eye color that fit the Nazis' twisted criteria are selected for re-education in German families. The rest are sent onward, to a place whose name you have never heard, Chełmno, in occupied Poland. There, many are murdered in gas vans, killed anonymously, far from the fields where they once played. Back in Prague, phones ring, reports are made. The measure has been carried out. Karl Hermann Frank listens, nods, perhaps makes notes. From his vantage point, the operation is a success, swift, decisive, total. But it is not yet complete. Destroying the people of Lidice is only half of the message. The other half is to destroy the place itself. In the days that follow, German units return with explosives and heavy equipment. Houses are burned if they are still standing, then knocked down. The church is blown up. The cemetery is desecrated. Gravestones smashed. Graves opened and leveled. Rubble is cleared. The ground is plowed. Trees are planted where homes once stood. On orders approved at the highest levels of the Protectorate administration, the name Lidice is removed from official maps. Signposts with the village's name are taken down. In public announcements, Karl Hermann Frank declares that Lidice has ceased to exist as punishment for supposed complicity in Heydrich's assassination. Most war crimes leave ruins. Karl Hermann Frank wanted nothing left, not walls, not graves, not even a name. For him, the perfect act of terror is one the victims do not survive, and the outsiders can barely prove. If you find these hidden, uncomfortable corners of World War II as important to confront as we do, we'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button. These stories of power, paper, and lives erased deserve to be told, and by subscribing, you help ensure they are not forgotten again. Lidice was meant to be a warning. It became something else as well. In the Protectorate, news of the massacre spread quickly, despite censorship. People whispered in factories and in tramcars, a whole village gone, the men shot, the women taken away, the children vanished. The intended message was clear. This is what happens when anyone strikes at the Reich. Speak out, and we will not just kill you, we will annihilate your family, your neighbors, your home. For some, fear worked. Resistance networks became more cautious. The knowledge that a single act of defiance could bring catastrophe on innocents weighed heavily. For others, the horror deepened their resolve. Lidice became a martyr in Czech hearts, a symbol of what the enemy was, and why they could not be tolerated in their land. Beyond the borders of the Protectorate, the name Lidice took on a different kind of power. The Czechoslovak government, in exile, and Allied governments publicized the massacre as a stark example of Nazi barbarism. Newspapers in Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and elsewhere told the story. Photographs of the destroyed village, of surviving women and orphans appeared in magazines. Radio broadcasts named Heydrich as a place whose fate demanded justice. In several countries, towns and streets were renamed in solidarity. A mining village in England took the name Lidice. In the United States, communities sponsored Lidice Shall Live campaigns, raising funds to help rebuild after the war. Children born in some places were given Lidice as a middle name. What Karl Hermann Frank had tried to erase from the map began to appear on new maps far away. Inside the Protectorate, Frank remained at the center of power. After Heydrich's death, other Reich protectors came and went. But as Minister of State for Bohemia and Moravia and higher SS and police leader, Frank continued to oversee the machinery of occupation, arrests, deportations, executions, forced labor. He did not slow down the apparatus of repression, he refined it. The assassins themselves were eventually found. In June 1942, German forces surrounded the church where they were hiding. After a fierce fight, they killed themselves rather than be captured. Their last stand became another legend. But in terms of administrative power, it did not change much. The man in the office with the pen still signed orders. The warp and weft of daily terror continued. In 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, Karl Hermann Frank tried to flee. U.S. forces captured him in Czechoslovakia. The question then became, what does justice look like for a man whose most infamous acts were committed with signatures and stamps? He was handed over to Czechoslovak authorities and put on trial in Prague in 1946. The proceedings were public. Crowds packed the courtroom and gathered outside, listening to radio reports. Survivors of Nazi persecution in the Protectorate, Czechs, Jews, resistance members, and some of the women of Lidice who had lived through Ravensbrück and other camps, sat on benches and watched the man whose orders had shaped their suffering. The indictment covered a range of crimes: participation in the destruction of Czechoslovak independence, involvement in mass arrests and executions, responsibility for deportations and the murder of Jews, and centrally, direct responsibility for the massacre of Lidice and other reprisals. In court, documents were read aloud, orders bearing his name, minutes of meetings where he advocated severe measures, public proclamations announcing executions, the language of bureaucracy, measures, evacuations, special treatment, was translated back into what it had meant on the ground: shootings, deportations, gas. Frank's defense was familiar. He claimed he had been a subordinate, that he was carrying out directives from higher authorities, that he had no personal malice against Czechs, that he had sometimes tried to moderate the harshest demands from Berlin. His lawyers argued that the real architects of terror were Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, and others now dead or beyond the court's reach. For the judges and for many in the public, the distinction did not absolve him. He had not been a low-level clerk stamping papers without understanding. He had been the one who brought proposals to the Reich Protector, who interpreted Hitler's rage into specific reprisals, who led the very apparatus that turned ideology into arrests and bullets. What he signed in secret in 1942 was now read aloud in a courtroom, line by line, evidence not just of orders given, but of what kind of man gives them. He was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death. On 22nd May 1946, in Prague's Pankrak prison, Karl Hermann Frank was hanged. The execution took place in front of a large crowd. Authorities allowed public access as a form of catharsis and warning. Czech radio described the scene, naming him the chief symbol of Nazi occupation. For many, his death felt like a necessary, if incomplete, answer to the years of fear that had hung over their country. But no execution could bring back what had been erased. In the years after the war, survivors of Lidice, mostly women who had returned from camps and a handful of children who had been located after Germanization, came back to a place that no longer existed. The old village was gone, its foundations buried. A new Lidice was built nearby, not on top of the erased one, but within sight of its former fields. Memorials rose, statues of children, walls engraved with names, a museum preserving photographs and testimonies. Every year, people gather there to remember. They read out the names of the dead. They walk the grass where houses once stood. They tell the story to children who were not yet born when the last survivor of the massacre died. The goal is not to reopen wounds for their own sake, but to keep one lesson alive. This is what it looks like when power, ideology, and bureaucracy align without conscience. Imagine you are one of the women of Lidice, brought back after the war to an open field and a new village that carries the old name. You stand in a courtroom and look at a man who says he was only obeying orders when he chose your home as an example. He talks about duty, about state security, about following directives. What does justice look like to you at that moment? Is there any sentence that balances what a signature on his desk did to your life? Now imagine you are a modern bureaucrat in any country at any time, asked to sign a paper that will make life much harder for a group of people you will never meet. Maybe it is a mass eviction. Maybe it is an order to deny medical care to a certain category. Maybe it is a piece of security policy that paints a whole community as a threat. You tell yourself it's just policy, that the real decisions were made above you, that your role is technical. Where does that road end? Was Karl Hermann Frank simply following a genocidal system, or did he add his own cruelty and ambition to make it worse? If a crime is committed with a pen instead of a gun, should the person who signs the order be judged the same as the man who pulls the trigger? In your view, is there ever a situation where just doing my job is a valid defense when lives are on the line? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions that hang over every file stamped by a hand that will never see the faces it affects. If this story made you see the quiet, bureaucratic side of wartime evil more clearly, please hit that like button. Every click tells the algorithm this history is worth remembering. We're dedicated to uncovering the minds and decisions that shaped World War II from the shadows. If you want to join us on that mission, subscribe and turn on notifications. Where are you watching from? And had you heard of Lidice before this? Tell us in the comments what you think justice should look like for crimes like this. Should there be a statute of limitations on decisions that erase lives? Should "I was only following orders" ever close the discussion? Thank you for ensuring that Lidice and the people destroyed by a man who thought ink and paper could erase them do not disappear into silence. They deserve to be remembered.